Hello, my name is Lynne Hilton Wilson, and I'm excited to talk with you today on the hard questions in church history regarding the splinter groups and the prophets, following the prophet's death. The question of succession was in many people's minds in 1844 to 1860 and continues to be a very interesting subject to historians, but a very delicate subject. I'm following along in the Come Follow Me from section 135 and 136 in the Doctrine and Covenants. I have many hard questions that I've had to dive into, and I hope that some of these overlap with yours, but what I really hope is that you will take your hard questions to the Joseph Smith Papers projects, to excellent resources on Book of Mormon Central, and to the Lord on your knees until you can find answers as well. Number one, when did Joseph stop trusting Sidney Rigdon? And why did Sidney want to raise up a church to Joseph? Number three, did the prophet Joseph name his son as a successor? Number four, what did the different splinter groups claim? Number five, why didn't Emma and the other Smiths go to Utah? Why did they stay behind in Nauvoo? Number six, had Joseph III really not read the Book of Mormon before becoming president of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? These are just some of the questions that we'll be talking about, but there's many, many more that I hope to touch. Let's start with a timeline and just put things in context. We know that this prophet died on June 27th, 1844, when he and Hiram were murdered in Carthage jail. On July 8th, Parley P. Pratt encouraged the saints in Nauvoo to continue their daily pursuits and make no movements until the return of the remainder of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. But Sidney Rigdon arrived first, and he had been serving in the First Presidency, even though he had not been living in the same state. And we'll talk more about that in a while, but he was living in Pittsburgh, and on August 3rd, he returned. 3 days later, Brigham and the other apostles returned. On August 8th is when the mantle of Joseph falls upon Brigham Young, and thousands of members of the church vote to sustain the apostles after this miraculous witness that they received as to who the Lord had chosen. Over a year later, on December 10th, the temple was completed enough for the saints to receive their endowments there. And Lucy was included in that first group that were part of the Nauvoo temple services there as she served. On February 4th, the first group of saints exited Nauvoo on the frozen Mississippi River, leaving their beloved temple. On May 1st, the temple was completed and Orson Hyde dedicated it. On July 24th, 1847, we know that Brigham Young and the other pioneers arrived in the Salt Lake Valley. In 48, on October 9th, the interior of the Nauvoo temple was burned by an arsonist. And on March 27th, there was some sort of a horrendous tornado whirlwind, and the exterior walls of the Nauvoo temple were destroyed. On April 6th of 1860 is when Joseph Smith III and his mother are escorted in and joined the new organization, which was later referred to as the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So we'll try to go that far. I just wanted to let you know, as usual, before something difficult, if we would look at the scriptures, we usually have answers already there. And in the New Testament, both from Peter and Paul, we have many warnings about false teachers who were coming into the church and splinter groups that were forming in Christianity. And the same way that Satan worked in the early Christian church, we see him working in the Restoration. And in fact, Joseph also gave warnings. He asked the Lord when he was in Liberty Jail, why have some of my dear friends left the church? And why are those who are called not willing to stay tuned with their faith and their commitment, even after seeing miracles and having witness of the Spirit? And the Lord answers him, which was recorded in section 121, when Joseph asks, why are they not chosen? And he says, because they are aspiring to the honors of men. And as you know, he goes on in that beautiful letter that's recorded in verse 37. When we undertake to cover our sins or to gratify our pride, our vain ambitions, and to exercise control or dominion or compulsion upon the souls of the children of men in any degree of unrighteousness, behold, the heavens withdraw themselves, and the Spirit of the Lord is grieved. And when it is withdrawn, amen to the priesthood and authority of that man. And then he continues on in verse 39. We have learned by sad experience, and this is repeated so often, if we're honest, we could probably even see it in our own lives, that anytime we begin practicing unrighteous dominion, we lose the Spirit of God, and we lose the correct authority, and we misunderstand things, and we begin fighting against the church. That's what happened in Missouri, and that's what happened also in Nauvoo that we'll now look at. So the first question that I have here chronologically is, did the Lord give instruction on how to send his future church? And I would have to stand firmly on the ground saying absolutely yes. And anyone who's been reading their Doctrine and Covenants this year can probably remember back to many of these experiences. In fact, though, Joseph gave multiple statements that are a little bit different than the scriptures, and that's where some of the confusion came in. When I go back and I read Joseph's statements, I'm thinking, that doesn't mean they're going to be his successor as his passing. It just means that they were joining in the help. But there were different times in Joseph's life, the last decade of his life, between 34 and 44, where he does give enough of a hint that some people were able to construe it to say these were the reasons why they felt like they could be a successor for Joseph. There's a verse in the scripture that says the counselor should share authority with the prophet and step up and help the prophet as needed. Well, that's where Sidney takes his call from. There was a special appointment made. Some people claimed that. Perhaps the office of the associate president. The presiding patriarch is one that William Smith claims. The Council of 50, when Joseph rolls his shoulder, that's that sermon that was given in March of 1844 that we'll talk about later. The Quorum of the 12 Apostles, as Section 107 claims. The three priesthood councils, and a descendant of Joseph Smith, which Joseph himself made according to eyewitnesses that heard him speak of it. Let's talk first of all about Section 90, when Sidney Rigdon felt like he had been given authority to take over. In verse 50 of Section 90, it says, according to the handwritten account here, they are accounted as equal with the three in holding the keys of the last kingdom. But what Sidney missed here is that the prophet has to be part of the three, and that the counselors are only counselors, that they are not equal in authority, but together they hold the keys. And then we go to Section 107 and Section 112 in 1835, where we were told that the apostles form a quorum equal in authority and power to the three presidents previously mentioned. 11th to 26th, as the Council of 50 were meeting, and this is the council that we talked about when Joseph was running for president, that was going to become a political body, that was a different kind of a council than a spiritual body. In 1844, Joseph has this meeting that it was named later the Last Charge. And in the presence of the 12 apostles and others that were there on March 26, 1844, Joseph said, "And in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, I now place it upon my brethren in this council, and I shake my skirts clear of the responsibilities from this time forth." Many interpreted this in their notes as they recorded it, that Joseph was referring to the 12 apostles. And this statement here is by Benjamin Johnson, but they were not written down until a little bit later. And again, later, when Brigham is in Utah, he says that Joseph had said to me, "I shall have a son born to me, and his name should be called David, and on him in some future time will rest the responsibility that now rests upon me." This is very interesting because David Hiram had not been born, and other people also wrote down different prophecies that were given about this young man, David Hiram. And David Hiram has a very interesting life. And when we get to his birth in 1844, I'll talk a little bit more about how he may have been one who was in line to receive some of these blessings, but unfortunately did not receive them. At the time of Joseph Smith's death, the apostles, 9 of the apostles, were out on missions doing their work to spread his name as a future candidate for the President of the United States. And they were scattered over the north and south, and even down into Texas in places where there were not states. That's where Lyman White was. And so when they finally got the news, most of them had received promptings from the Lord before they received the news. But when they finally got the news, it had already happened. And Brigham Young commented while he was in New England, "The first thing which I thought of was whether Joseph had taken the keys of the kingdom with him from the earth. But then," I exclaimed, "the keys of the kingdom are right here with the church." And in the journals of many of the other members of the 12, they record their feelings and their prayers and their thoughts as they all try to hurry back across, 1,000 miles or 800 miles, whatever it is, depending on where they are. And most of them are able to arrive back in early August. But 2 apostles were in Nauvoo at the time of the prophet's death. And those 2, of course, were in Carthage with him. John Taylor, who was shot and was recovering still of all of his bullet wounds, and then Willard Richards, who was untouched. And we know the stories that we talked about earlier, and from the beautiful accounts in Saints of how the saints mourned and had a beautiful time where they were able to have a viewing of the bodies and have a beautiful services of a funeral for the 2 brothers. And by the time Parley P. Pratt is asking the saints to get back to their lives and continue on, Nauvoo was under a terrible state of mourning, and the saints were so shocked that a lot of work had just come to a standstill. And Parley P. Pratt was back and encouraging them to continue on with their farming and their harvesting and preparing for the time when the 12 would be back, and to not try to make any decisions without the organization of the priesthood in to stay. However, Sidney was closer. He was only 700 miles away, and he arrived on August 3rd. And he immediately wanted to offer a suggestion that he raise up a church to Joseph, and that he went as the custodian of the church, as the counselor to Joseph, that he would take over and that he would be what he called a guardian. And if you read his sermons and his suggestions that he starts giving immediately as soon as he comes, he starts calling prayer meetings. It doesn't sound all that bad. But as you put it in context of who he was and what happens afterward, it's quite scary. And it is a concern to me because he was not necessarily always in his right mind. He wants to act quickly. He doesn't want to wait until the 12 are back, which is also a little red flag to be concerned. Why the rush? And he calls the church together, both on the Iowa side and in the Illinois side, to gather in Nauvoo on August 6th for an important meeting where they will make this decision. Well, William Mark steps in and says, absolutely not. We are not going to make this decision until the 8th. And he just pushes it back 2 days. And I believe that was inspired by God. I want to talk a minute, though, about Sidney Rigdon. I've given little hints throughout this year on some of his challenges that let you know that something wasn't right. But I just have now compiled them to be a little more forceful and a little more understanding of who he was. In March of 32, so he's only been a member of the church about a year, the Lord called Sidney as a counselor. And just a few months later, on July 5th, Sidney claims to receive revelation and to take over the church, and that he should be the president of the church, not Joseph, and he is disfellowshipped from the church. On February 38, in Liberty Jail, he complained that he had suffered more than Jesus, actually greater than Jesus Christ himself. And that's when they let him go out, because they know that he's not in his right mind to try to heal at home. That's next year, in March of 39, Sidney tells the saints in Quincy that they need to scatter and that the church is finished and it's come to an end and that they need to leave. Joseph comes, by April and gathers everyone together and says, no, that is not right. I've received revelation. We're all going to be moving together. A couple of years later, in 1841, due to Sidney's illnesses, John C. Bennett is called to assist Sidney in the first presidency. He is not necessarily the only counselor, but he is an assistant of the counselor. On August 3rd, in 1843, Sidney is disfellowshipped for aiding those who are fighting against the church. On August 7th of 1843, the church membership votes to keep Sidney in the first presidency. And Joseph says, I have thrown him off my shoulders and you have again put him on me. You may carry him, but I will not. And so when Sidney says, I want to raise up a church to Joseph and Hiram, and when he says, let's hurry and have this meeting on the 6th, and William Mark says, absolutely not, we're going to move it to the 8th, you have reason to pause. And so by the time on August 7th, as some of these apostles are arriving, and actually some of them arrived on the night of the 6th, but as they arrive on the 7th and they hear that this meeting is called and they return, they meet together in John Taylor's house. John Taylor is still so sick. from so many gunshot wounds that he can't leave. He can't leave his bed. So Heber and Brigham and Elder Kimball and Richards and Wilford Woodruff and George A. Smith and Lyman White and Parley and Orson Pratt all gather in his home and discuss what's going to be doing. And they are thrilled that the saints are going to be gathering the next morning, and they are planning on gathering in the afternoon. But Sidney says, no, let's have a prayer meeting. And as it turns out, the 12 are going to be having their meeting also on the 8th to pray and to learn the Lord's will. But Brigham felt prompted to go and see what was all this gathering about, and realizes that Sidney is trying to take over the church while the 12 are in having a meeting. And so Sidney is there, and Brigham says, wait a minute. This is not the plan. Let's hear Sidney. And Sidney speaks, for hours and hours. As usual, it's over a 2-hour sermon. And they close, and Brigham says, now let's come back this afternoon when the 12 are here, and let's make our decision on our vote then. And that's just what happened. At 2 p.m., after their lunch break, they gathered. And Brigham speaks for just a short period of time. He says, I say unto you that the quorum of the 12 have the keys of the kingdom of God in all the world. And during that time, as Brigham is speaking in that short period of time, we have several dozens, if not hundreds, of accounts of eyewitnesses who are there. And I'll just read George Q. Cannon's account here about what happens. No sooner had President Brigham Young arose than the power of God rested down upon him in the face of all the people. And it did not appear to be Brigham Young. It appeared to be Joseph Smith that spoke to the people. Joseph, in his looks and in his manner and in his voice, even his figure was transformed so that it looked like that of Joseph. And everybody present who had the Spirit of God saw that he was the man whom God had chosen to hold the keys now. And the prophet Joseph had gone beyond the veil. Here's another one. W.W. Phelps was then asked to speak. Actually, Brigham didn't ask W.W. Phelps to speak because he's not an apostle. But Brigham said, Sidney, do you have anything else to say? And Sidney says, no, I'm going to have W.W. Phelps speak for me. Sidney was so confident that W.W. Phelps would defend him because Sidney hadn't been around for so long. He'd been out of the state. He wasn't aware of people's feelings. He didn't know what W.W. Phelps was going to say. But Brother Phelps was loyal to Joseph and to the apostles. He says, Joseph came to me. He says, just a couple nights ago, I had a vision, and Joseph came to me as if he were alive. And he said, tell the drivers to drive on. And I asked if the building was on wheels. And he said, certainly. I spoke and it went away. And we drove all around the hills and the villages and over the rivers and into Iowa. And so we did. And when I awoke, I said, let us go ahead and build up the temple. And when you will be endowed, when the temple is completed, all the honorable mothers in Israel will be endowed as well as the elders. And if you want to do it right, uphold the 12. Well, poor Sidney had all the air let out of his balloon, and Brigham called the saints to vote. He said, do you want to sustain the 12? And the saints raised their arms unanimously to support the 12. So when we talk about splinter groups, we need to remember that it was not even close to a majority. It wasn't even close to a tithe of the people. But I do not know the numbers exactly. I can just tell you the numbers after a couple of years. I don't know the numbers that immediately. But as the saints voted to sustain the apostles that were there, the 9 that were there at that time, the saints rallied around and voted to not only support the 12 apostles, but to continue building the temple. Now, Brigham was not called to be the prophet of the church until they were in winter quarters, a year later. But during all this time, one of my major questions is, what about Emma? Was Emma at this meeting? Did Emma have this experience? And we see Emma in these early days after Joseph's death as clarifying her role in Nauvoo. She is pregnant with David Hiram, and she is trying to sustain what had been established by Joseph. And in 1841, Joseph had already started giving farmland and putting it in the name of his wife and his children. $2,700 worth of in Hancock County had been written over so that Emma would have plenty to take care of herself and with her children's names. But unfortunately, these land transactions were not written up in a will, but Emma had the deeds to them. And so some of the land had not been fully paid for. And so the creditors are coming after Emma instead of coming after whoever else owned the land in Hancock County without a title to the lot. This was interesting. In the Nauvoo house, Emma owned the lot, but not the house. And the house had debts on it, so the creditors came to her since she owned the lot. And poor Emma was just beside herself. She said, I have no documents or papers in my possession of a historical character, whatever. All the records of Mr. Smith's of that nature were left with Willard Richards and William Clayton. And she's just desperate for help. And the brethren are not giving her exactly what she wants. And they're trying to defend the church. And she's trying to defend her children. And they're trying to cooperate. But it is a delicate, sensitive situation. And I have enough documentation, I have read enough things that in these early 2 or 3 years, I would say everyone is bending over backwards to help. But it was not interpreted always that way. And once the baby was born on November 17th, Emma begins to just stay home. And David Hiram was named as the name that Joseph gave prior to his death, as his request to Emma to name his son. And he becomes a unique child. 2 dear friends of Emma's who had lived in her home that she had ostracized when she found out they were the plural marriage issues, even though Emma herself had invited the Partridges that Joseph be sealed to them. She had stood as a witness to the sealing. She still asked them to leave the house and asked Joseph to annul the sealings. And Emily Partridge, after the baby was born, came back and said to Emma in her journal that night, after she congratulated Emma and had brought something for the baby, she wrote down, Emma was very gracious, for there was no Joseph to be jealous of. It was a very open wound for Emily as well, but she was trying to build bridges. They were trying to reconcile, realizing it was very difficult on all sides. Eliza R. wrote a beautiful poem that you can read in the Joseph Smith Papers Project, and I also have portions of it in my handout that's attached to this. But the saints began focusing on the temple, and much of the money that they did have at their disposal went into the temple. The Lord had told the saints, do not go in debt for this temple. And so they used much of the money that they had in that purpose. And Lucy Mack Smith was involved in that session when the temple was finished enough that they were able to begin endowments in the session. Remember, before that, the endowments had been in the red brick store for the men and the women in the mansion house with Emma, starting with the initiatories with the sisters. And many of them received their endowment there. But the general population of the church, not just the wives of the general authorities, began receiving them on December 10th. And the stories there are well known, and so I won't go into all of them. But they saints did not all have the chance. And so Brigham finally gives in and opens the temple 24/7. And instead of letting the saints go, he lets these endowments go on. And remember, these endowments are sometimes are recorded at 6 hours long. And so it's not like you can get a 90-minute session through and do 24/7 a little bit faster. It was very difficult. But Emma at this time bids the saints farewell. She has decided not to go early. She is not feeling harmonized with Brigham at this time. And so people realize that she's staying. And many people come realizing that they can't help her in any other way. So they deed her their property. And we have records of people saying, Emma, if you can just give me $1, here is my home, or here is my farmland. And so Emma is able to gain even more property than she had from Joseph initially. As the saints leave, they're trying to build bridges there. She has given many invitations to move west. She's given opportunities for wagons and food and preparation. Elder Richards and Kimball and Clayton, as representatives of the 12 apostles, come by the home and give her $1,000 in cash as a goodwill offering before they leave. The 12 also told her that they would intended to help her in every way possible. And part of the problem here is they suggested that every year they give her some money. But William Smith, Lucy's son, Joseph's brother, steps in and says, I don't trust you. I want all the money now. And then unfortunately it gets squandered. And both Lucy and Emma are left in a worse position than they would have been if they had accepted the offer that the 12 had suggested. The Venerable Lucy Smith was also given a poem by Eliza R. that is just beautiful, and I've got a portion of it here. The aged, venerated, much beloved mother of Zion, and the mother of the greatest men this generation had. Yes, the venerable lady, thou shalt live while life to thee shall be a blessing. Thou art dear to every faithful saint. Thousands already bless thee. Millions yet to come will venerate thy name and speak thy praise. And I am one of those million who raised my voice to do just that. As you know, on February 4th, as the Mississippi River froze, Charles Shumway was the first to lead the saints across the waters, or the frozen ice, as they made their way to winter quarters. 6 months later, in September of 46, those that were left were so angry at anybody that was still lingering on that there was a Battle of Nauvoo, and Emma saw some attempt to burn her home, and so she boarded the steamship, the Uncle Toby, and went 100 miles or so north up to Fulton, Illinois, and she rented a home there. We have the address on the base of Bay Street and Wall Street on that corner, and I looked it up on Google Earth and couldn't find those streets anymore in Fulton, but I assume that they are there, and she rented out the mansion house, but just 6 months later, she hears rumors. Actually, this is now February 19th, 47, so it's a year later. Nope, it's February. It is just 6 months later. It's 6 months later. She learns that this man who has been renting out her house is now auctioning off all of her furniture and planning on robbing it all from her to furnish what he wanted on this reclaimed boat that he had. And she comes down and chases him out and reclaims her home and tries to keep as much as she had then. And while she is in Nauvoo, and this was February when she tries to return, but that fall is when she is courted by Mr. Lewis Crum Bittman. And he comes to court Emma, and in the records that are recorded of this time period, we have a great little story, and I believe this is written by her son. Mr. Bittman, catching sight of my mother sewing in an upper window of the mansion house, made a very low and polite and widely sweeping bow. Regarding his erect posture after his elaborate ceremony, he replaced his hat upon his head, and he stepped forward briskly. But then suddenly a clothesline he had failed to observe caught him across the forehead just under the brim of his hat, and off flew his hat. But alas, also with it flew a very fine toupee. And Emma laughed as Lewis shouted, "That wig," he swore. I wasn't going to swear. The embarrassing situation proved to be no handicap to the gallant gentleman, for he was made of sterner stuff. And as you know, Emma marries Mr. Bittman. He is a steamship, at the time that Emma met him anyway. He had other professions earlier, but he is one of those people that is running a steamship up and down the Mississippi and had docked at Nauvoo. And the two of them, Emma falls in love with him, and the two of them are married, ironically, on Joseph Smith's birthday, December 23rd, 1847, by a Methodist minister. Because of this, people have questioned, did Emma become a Methodist? Did she return to her first faith, the faith of her childhood? Mr. Bittman was a Methodist, and we know that Emma did not raise her children continued in the faith. Her oldest son had never read the Book of Mormon. None of her children were read the Book of Mormon. None of the children knew about the history of the church, of the stories that are so dear to our children who are raised in the faith. And so it has been claimed by many accounts that are written from this period of time that that Emma and Lewis joined the Methodist faith. However, we have a record from Emma in the last few days of her life, as she's looking back on it, when she says, "I have been called an apostate, but I have never apostatized, nor forsaken the faith I at first accepted." So I would like to give her the benefit of the doubt and allow that to be stated. And let's look also at Lucy Mack. Lucy continues to function as the grand matriarch in the church. She joins prayer circle meetings with the apostles. She is serving in the temple on that great December 1845 date that I've mentioned now 3 times. And in April of 1846, the church deeded to her a home that had been Joseph Noble's home. And Lucy moves in there with her daughters, Julia, Sophronia, Catherine, and Lucy. And some of them have their spouses living with them, and they live in that home together. But when William steps in, he feels quite differently and wants to become the next prophet. And he thinks he should be the president of the church. And he has a very strong persuasion with his mother. And I also want to go back and give you a little history on William. On February 15th, 1835, he was called as one of the first apostles. However, his name was not submitted by the 3 witnesses that were called to do this calling. And as we know, the Lord had called them very early on, years before 1835. The 3 witnesses were told, you have the responsibility to seek out and find the 12 apostles. And his name was not there. And Joseph took out another name and put in his little brother. And Oliver Cowdery later said, it has been an embarrassment my entire life to have had William Smith serving as an apostle when people think that I put him in there, because they always knew he had challenges. But I'm not going to throw any stones. Joseph's always willing to forgive. I don't know anything about what went into that inspiration. But by May 4th of 1835, just a few months after he's called, he's already suspended from an apostleship by the church vote because they saw his behavior. But by May 25th, Joseph has reinstated him back in. Joseph wants to give his little brother another chance. Joseph's always quick to forgive. October 31st of that same year, William himself resigns as an apostle because he's mad at his brother about something. And December of that year, he gets so mad at his brother that he enrages in a fist fight at a quorum meeting where they're all gathered, and he and Joseph have fisticuffs. January 2nd of 36, just a month later, he's restored again to the position of an apostle. In 1837, the president of the quorum right then was David Patton, and he questions William's apostolic position and suggests that he be removed. In 38, William is temporarily disfellowshipped. In 39, he is suspended again from his apostleship. In a 5-year period, there are 5 times when he was removed from the apostleship. This is not someone who has a clean record. In 1844, after the prophet's passing, William comes to Brigham and says, I, by right, should be the patriarch of the church. And Brigham agreed. However, Brigham did not act on it quickly. It wasn't until May 24th of 1845, so, 8-9 months later, that he actually ordains him as the church patriarch. And then a month later, William says, as church patriarch, I claim to be the president of the church. And he had convinced his mother so much of this, and his mother, in her state, claimed that she also had had 3 visions as evidence that her son William was supposed to be the next prophet. By 1845, shortly after this, William publishes his proclamation to the church. And in it, he gets very upset that the church is not supporting his family enough. He thinks they've got the blue blood, and he thinks everyone should be bowing to them. He's talking about his mother. He uses his mother a lot, sort of as a pawn, I think, to get people's heartstrings going. The careworn visage of my poor old mother, broken down as she is and almost worn out with the accumulated troubles of years, ridiculed in the public stand, and by the very men over whom she has acted as a mother in the church, deprived of all honor and station in the church, have no word of controlment in the affairs of the church, and that those who did seem to have a voice should be by now shut out. He continues to claim authority of the church and is disfellowshipped or excommunicated. But it's interesting, one of our greatest attackers of the church in Illinois was William Sharp. And we've mentioned before that he starts this Warsaw Signal, a newspaper down in Warsaw that aggravated the mob, that got everybody riled up in order to fight against Joseph and got him eventually his martyrdom. Thomas Sharp writes about William Smith and says, William was doubtlessly actuated by selfish, interested motives. So it was clear to everyone around. And I just wanted to even mention some of the things that happened about William Smith as he joins other splinter groups. In 1845 is when he is excommunicated for apostasy by Brigham. So in 46 to 47 is when he starts befriending the Strangites. And this is when he is asked to bring over the mummies and things like that for the Strangites. By June of 47, he is with the Strangites, and he still writes back to Apostle Orson Hyde and asks for rebaptism and restoration of the apostleship, even though he has already joined the Strangites. But by October of 47, he's excommunicated by Strang for adultery. He's just balancing act all the time. So now let's talk about some of these splinter groups. I feel like I've already touched on some of them, but the problem was the apostles do not know exactly where they're going. They're following inspiration. They're following promptings that they've had. They know that it's going to be in the West. They know it's in the Rocky Mountains. The Lord has given Brigham visions and revelations that it will be in the top of the Rocky Mountains. He's seen where he's supposed to go. They've already started far west, but Sidney Rigdon remained in Nauvoo for a short period of time. And there were probably at least a half dozen to a dozen splinter groups that came in the next decade or so. But there were three that really took a hold of more than 100 people. And these three were Sidney Rigdon with the Church of Jesus Christ of the Children of Zion that he organized in Pittsburgh in 1845. J.J. Strang had the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Strangite in 44 and 45 and 46. And Joe Smith III joined the new organization in 1860. I had mentioned a little bit about Sidney's background up until the time of 1844. So I've got another little timeline here. On October 12th of 44, since it was clear that the majority of the saints were going to be following Brigham, he gathers his supporters in Pittsburgh. And on April 6th of 45, they organized the Church of Jesus Christ of the Church of Children of Zion. And he calls 12 apostles, he calls 70. He claims that Joseph was a fallen prophet. So no longer does he want to raise up a church unto Joseph. Now he says Joseph is a fallen prophet, and his followers include people that used to fight against Joseph, like the sheep's and wolf clothing John C. Bennett, like the adulterer John C. Bennett. And by 46, his membership mainly leave because his rash prophecies have failed, and he also introduces polygamy under the encouragement of John C. Bennett. So by 1846, after a very short time, he decides to leave his congregation that he has organized, and he seeks a life of seclusion in Friendship, New York, and continues to claim marvelous revelations until his death, but he never leaves his secluded life as a monk. And I have great faith that the Lord will reward Sidney for all the good that he has done, and that Sidney will receive his heart's desire. That is my hope and prayer, because I really know he had done so much good in the church. I'm sorry for the hardships. But J.J. Strang was not a lifelong member. In fact, just a few months before the prophet's death, on February 25th, 1844, he came in contact with the church and was baptized. And he came to Nauvoo and joined with the saints, and he claimed that on June 18th, just a week or so before the prophet's death, that he received a letter from Joseph saying, "You will be my successor." He also claimed at the moment of Joseph's martyrdom that an angel came and ordained him. During his time that he was gathering his ideas to form a church, he said that he too can translate ancient records, and that he too would have the Urim and Thummim at his hand, and that he wanted to continue to look back through the Old Testament, but he would also restore animal sacrifice, and he would restore worship not on the Sabbath as Christians do in pattern of the Lord's resurrection, but he would go back to the Old Testament and have the Sabbath on the seventh day after the day of the creation. So we look at this letter, because really a lot is standing on, did he receive a letter from Joseph Smith or not? And many people have gone back and looked at the handwriting and said, it's not from Joseph. In fact, it's not from any of Joseph's scribes. In fact, it's not from any of Joseph's family members. In fact, it doesn't fit the handwriting of any person we have that was a member of the church at the time. It just doesn't fit. It's a very unique handwriting. You can zoom in on my handout here and see it. But that really is what he used as the basis, except of course for his ordination. And at his peak, J.J. Strang gathered 2,000 followers. Martin Harris, William McClellan, George Miller, John and David Whitmer, and for a very, very brief time, even Lucy Mack Smith courted the idea of joining. But as he introduced polygamy, and as he, in 1850, was crowned to be their king, he claimed to be needing to restore a kingdom in America, and had them crown him, his handful of followers in the woods of Wisconsin, and he was shot then by those followers a few years later in 1855. And some of those followers left and said, okay, we got to start a new religion. They leave Strang, and they go briefly to try Brigham's out, and they say, no, that's not working, and there's a small group of followers say, okay, we're going to try again. We're leaving Strang, or else we're leaving Brigham, in Utah. We're going to try starting another one. And in 1851, two people receive a revelation that maybe Brigham's son should be the head of the church. Jason Briggs and Zenas Gurley. And these two men join forces together and say, let's make a new organization. And from 1852, when they hold this conference in Beloit, Wisconsin, ironically again, Wisconsin, they start gathering people and gathering momentum. And a lot of people that had left the Strangites start joining them, and they start asking for Emma's children to help build this around them. Now, as you recall, when the prophet died, he had 4 living children, and Emma was expecting David Hiram. At this time, Joseph III was 11 and a half years old. I was surprised that he hadn't read the Book of Mormon by 11 and a half, but the copies were sparse, and I'm sure the stories were told. But according to the historians of the Community of Christ that I have studied, they claim he had not ever read the Book of Mormon at the time of his father's death. And so we look at several years later now, from 1851, when they begin saying that they've had this revelation, Joseph Smith III, by age 27, is willing to step in and become president of this organization. And with his mother's arm, hand in hand, the two walk into the church on April 6th in 1860 in Illinois, and at the organization day, Joseph Smith III stands and says, "May God grant in his infinite mercy that I may never do anything to forfeit the high trust that you've confided to me. I pray that he may grant to us power to recall the scattered ones of Israel, and I ask for your prayers." It appears that he was humble. It appears that he received other revelations. He also wanted to make changes to the Joseph Smith translation that Emma had kept and did not allow Brigham to receive, which we talked about earlier in my earlier lessons. This is a delicate subject. And a few years later, they changed the name from the new organization to the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which we know in 2018, they no longer had members of Joseph's family running the church, and in hopes of making themselves more welcoming to the communities of Christianity globally, as they are now in 59 different countries across the world. They decided to no longer claim the Book of Mormon as revealed scripture, as more accurate than the Bible. And by so doing, they were then allowed to join the Christian community and change their name to be the Community of Christ. Currently, well, according to Wikipedia, in 2018, they had 250,000 saints. These are the major splinter groups, but the vast majority of the saints remained loyal to the apostles. And as I look at the challenges in my lifetime that the church has undergone, I see people coming and going, and I encourage everyone who struggles with certain leadership decisions or certain choices to remain true to what they know, to realize that God is running the church. It is not Joseph's church. It wasn't Brigham's church, and it's not Russell M. Nelson's church. It is the Lord's church, and he is running it. But unfortunately, he only has human beings to run it, and we do make mistakes, and we are offensive to one another. But if we can be patient and loving and forgiving, the Lord can cause great miracles out of small and simple things. And my testimony is that we belong to the Church of Jesus Christ. And I pray that that testimony can grow in your heart this year. Next week, we get to talk about the declarations, and I've chosen to speak about declaration number 2 on the race and the priesthood, and I hope you'll join us then. Thank you.